The first thing I remember clearly isn't a face, but the sound of the old ceiling fan in my grandmother's house, its weary groan slicing through humid summer air, circling endlessly like a secret that refused to rest. I was 8, sitting cross-legged on the cold tile floor, watching a drop of condensed water roll down a glass of lemonade left on the kitchen counter. My mother, Lila, stood by the sink, her back to me, washing dishes in the dim yellow light. The scent of fried shallots and detergent clung to her apron. Behind her, the window looked out to the courtyard where my uncles laughed over cheap beer, their voices thick with smoke and something sharper mockery. That was the sound of my childhood, laughter that didn't include me. Our house in Cedar Ridge was a modest 2-story home, but to me, it felt like a fortress of divided rooms. The walls carried whispers, comparisons between cousins, subtle jabs about who had the right father, the successful bloodline. My father, Raymond, was the youngest of 4 brothers, always the one trying to prove he belonged. He ran a small hardware shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where dust gathered faster than customers. My mother used to tell me, "We have what we need, Ava, and that's enough." But even then, I could tell it wasn't. Dinner was the one ritual that bound us, even when it felt like we were tied together by duty rather than affection. Every Sunday, the extended family gathered around the long oak table at my grandmother's house. It was a shrine to appearances: porcelain plates, lace runners, and conversation as fragile as the wine glasses that trembled with every raised voice. My Aunt Margaret always sat nearest the head of the table, the position she believed belonged to her because she married a man who built half the town's real estate. Her daughters, Emily and Claire, wore their privilege like perfume, sweet, invisible, and suffocating. When I brought home straight A's, Aunt Margaret would smile politely and say, "You get that from your mother's side, dear. The practical brains, not the ambitious ones." The others laughed, sipping their wine, as if I hadn't noticed the insult slipped between the compliments. One night, when I was 12, something happened that marked me more deeply than any bruise could. My father had just told everyone he planned to expand the hardware store into a small supply business. He'd been saving quietly, keeping his hopes folded in the same envelope as our grocery money. He believed that if he worked hard enough, maybe, just maybe, his brothers would finally see him as their equal. That evening, I remember the flicker of the chandelier, reflecting off Aunt Margaret's diamond ring as she clinked her glass. "Raymond," she said sweetly, "don't you think that's a bit ambitious? Hardware is one thing, but wholesale? You'd need investors for that." My father's smile faltered. "I've got some savings, and a loan possibility." Uncle Dean chuckled, not even looking up from his plate. "You'll drown in debt before the first order ships. Stick to fixing door hinges, Ray. That's your lane." The laughter that followed was soft, almost polite, but it carried a cruelty that filled the room like smoke. My mother stared at her plate. I looked at her hands tight around her fork, knuckles pale. She didn't say a word. After dinner, when we got home, I found my father sitting alone on the porch, cigarette ember glowing faintly in the dark. He didn't smoke often, only when he needed to hide something heavy behind silence. "Ava," he said quietly, "sometimes your own blood can make you feel like a stranger." That was the night I learned what silence could mean, how it could both protect and wound you. Years passed, and the laughter at family gatherings never changed. I grew taller, learned how to smile through discomfort, how to nod when relatives spoke as though my father's failures were family folklore. By the time I turned 16, his business dream had dissolved under the weight of unpaid bills and broken promises. He grew quieter, retreating into his tools and late nights at the shop. My mother carried the weight for both of them, her hands cracked from cleaning houses to keep us afloat. On my high school graduation day, everyone but the pride I had hoped to feel. Aunt Margaret brought a bouquet so large it barely fit in her arms, presenting it like an award. "We're so proud of you, Ava," she said in front of the crowd, "especially since you managed all this with such limited means." Her tone dripped with charity disguised as praise. I thanked her, smiled, and swallowed the bitterness that burned at the back of my throat. That night, while my classmates celebrated, I sat by my bedroom window, looking out at the faint glow of Cedar Ridge beyond the hills. I promised myself I'd leave that one day. I'd build something none of them could touch, something that would silence every condescending laugh that haunted our family dinners. The sound of the ceiling fan still filled my room, still spinning the same tired circles. But somewhere beneath it, a new sound began to form the quiet rhythm of defiance. I didn't know it then, but that promise, whispered to the night, would be the seed of everything that followed: the heartbreak, the betrayal, the ruin, and the rise. It would take years before I understood how deep family shadows could stretch, or how far I would go to step out of them. For now, all I had was that promise and the faint scent of detergent and lemon that lingered long after the laughter had faded. When I turned 18, the town of Cedar Ridge already felt too small for my lungs. The streets I grew up on, lined with wilted oaks and shuttered stores, had begun to feel like a graveyard of other people's dreams. My classmates scattered after graduation. Some went to college, some married early, and some, like my cousins Emily and Claire, flew off to private universities funded by family wealth. I had no scholarships, no savings, and no car, just a worn notebook filled with sketches of buildings and landscapes I had drawn since I was a child. I wanted to build places that made people feel safe, homes that breathed, spaces that didn't carry the weight of old arguments or unspoken resentments. Architecture had always been my quiet rebellion, shaping structure out of chaos. When I told my family I wanted to study design and eventually open my own resort someday, they laughed as if I'd said I wanted to live on the moon. At Sunday dinner, Aunt Margaret leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine. "A resort?" she repeated, eyes glimmering. "Darling, resorts are for people with money, not people who clean them." Uncle Dean smirked. "Maybe she'll marry into it." Their laughter tangled around the table. My father stared at his plate, his fork motionless. My mother squeezed my hand under the table, a silent gesture of solidarity that only deepened the ache in my chest. I didn't need their belief. I needed air. So I left Cedar Ridge with a single suitcase and $287 saved from part-time jobs at the local diner. I moved 3 hours north to Riverstone City, where I rented a basement room from a retired librarian named Mrs. Talbot. The room smelled faintly of mold and old books, but to me, it smelled like freedom. College was impossible to afford, so I took night classes at a community program instead, learning interior design software and basic construction principles. During the day, I worked at a cafe near the waterfront, serving cappuccinos to business people who never looked up from their phones. But every time I wiped a counter, I imagined marble bars and panoramic windows overlooking the sea. One evening, as I was closing the cafe, I met a man named Jacob Marin. He was in his 30s, with a quiet confidence that made people listen without realizing they were listening. He was an architect, newly relocated from Chicago to oversee a hotel renovation nearby. I admired the blueprints he carried like they were sacred texts. When he noticed my interest, he smiled. "You know what this means?" he asked, tapping a sketch of the atrium. "It means the building breathes," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing something I didn't know I possessed. "You understand space," he said softly. "That's rare." Jacob became my mentor, teaching me how to read plans, how to think in dimensions instead of dreams. He didn't coddle me, but he respected me, and that difference meant everything. He helped me apply for a design internship, unpaid but priceless. I began spending my nights at the drafting table, drawing until dawn, driven by something bigger than ambition. For the first time, I felt alive. But Cedar Ridge wasn't done with me. When I came home for my cousin Emily's wedding 2 years later, the air was thick with perfume and hypocrisy. The church was draped in white roses, every pew lined with the same faces that had doubted me. Emily floated down the aisle like royalty. I sat near the back, wearing a borrowed dress and the quiet confidence that came from earning my own rent. After the ceremony, during the reception, my relatives cornered me near the buffet table. Aunt Margaret's smile was razor-thin. "So, Ava," she said, "how's city life treating you? Still making lattes?" The laughter came in soft waves. I kept my voice calm. "Actually, I'm interning with Marin Designs. We're working on the Havenport Hotel renovation." The table went quiet. Emily blinked. Uncle Dean forced a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Our little waitress turned decorator." I smiled politely, but something inside me hardened. Their disbelief was almost flattering. It meant I had stepped beyond their imagination. Later that night, after the music faded and the guests began to leave, I overheard Aunt Margaret speaking to my mother near the entrance. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "Lila, don't fill her head with fantasies. This city thing won't last. She'll come home when she realizes she's just a small-town girl." My mother didn't respond, but I did. I walked straight past them, into the cool night air, my heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks in a declaration they'd never hear. I wouldn't come home again, not until I could return on my own terms. Back in Riverstone, Jacob introduced me to a small team of designers working on private retreats. He told me, "The best designs come from pain, Ava. You build what you wish you'd had." His words stayed with me. I poured everything I felt, every bruise from family mockery, every unspoken promise into my work. I imagined a place where people could come to heal, where no laughter cut you in half, where silence was peaceful instead of punishing. That was the birth of my dream resort. I called it Solara Haven, a place where light met water, where time slowed enough for people to breathe again. Jacob believed in me enough to sketch the first concepts together. You'll need investors, he warned, and patience. But this has soul. I nodded. Then it's worth it. I sent letters to my parents about my progress. Sometimes they wrote back, mostly about small-town news or my father's declining health. Aunt Margaret never mentioned my name. But one day, I received a letter from my cousin Claire. It was short, almost dismissive, ending with, "We're proud of you, I guess. But don't forget who you are." I folded the letter and placed it in my journal. The ink bled slightly from my fingers, smudging the words, "Don't forget who you are." It felt less like advice and more like a warning. Years later, I would look back on that smudge as a prophecy. Something was shifting beneath the surface, quiet and dangerous. There were promises made and debts unpaid. And somewhere between ambition and belonging, something was about to break. I didn't know it yet, but the first cracks had already begun to form in family, in trust, in the fragile bridge between who I was and who I was becoming. The year I turned 25, the city skyline no longer felt unreachable. By then, I had spent nearly 7 years building my craft late nights, tracing light angles on blueprints, dawns spent sketching over coffee cups in half-lit studios. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Jacob had introduced me to new clients, small projects at first vacation homes, cafe interiors, and finally, a boutique coastal property on the edge of Clearwater Bay. That project changed everything. The owners, an elderly couple named the Marshes, had bought an abandoned guest house overlooking the sea. They wanted to turn it into a modern retreat for artists, a place where people could rediscover silence and creativity. When I first stood there, the waves thundered against the rocks below, and the air smelled of salt and damp wood. The structure was rotting, the windows fogged with years of neglect, but beneath it all, I saw the bones of something beautiful. I spent nights designing by hand, candlelight flickering over my sketches. I chose driftwood tones, glass panels that framed the horizon, and textures that whispered rather than shouted. The Marshes trusted me completely, giving me freedom I'd never known before. 6 months later, when the final scaffolding came down, the once-forgotten guest house gleamed like a resurrection. News spread quickly. The Clearwater Echo ran a feature titled, "Young Designer Revives Coastal Ruin into Modern Sanctuary." They called me the girl who saw beauty where others saw decay. For the first time, my name meant something beyond the echo of mockery. Jacob brought a bottle of champagne to the ribbon cutting. "This is your first real victory, Ava," he said, smiling as the sunlight hit the water behind us. "Never let them make you small again." I nodded, and for a moment, I felt untouchable. But pride, I would learn, is often the first thing envy reaches for. When the article made its way to Cedar Ridge, my mother called. Her voice was filled with something between joy and disbelief. "Your father showed everyone the newspaper," she said. "Even your uncles." Margaret didn't say much, but she saw it. I could almost picture it, the family gathered around the old oak table, reading my name in print. I wanted to believe it softened something in them, that maybe, finally, I had earned a fragment of respect. 2 weeks later, I received a message from Aunt Margaret herself. The text was brief, almost reluctant. "Impressive work, Ava. You've grown quite a bit. We're hosting Emily's anniversary celebration next month. You should come, it's been too long." The invitation felt like bait wrapped in silk. Still, part of me, some stubborn, childlike part, wanted to go. I imagined arriving in my own car, wearing something elegant, walking into that hall, not as the poor relation but as a name they couldn't ignore. Against my better judgment, I said yes. The wedding hall shimmered with chandeliers and champagne flutes when I arrived. Laughter ricocheted off marble walls, just like it had years ago at Emily's first wedding. My relatives hovered near the bar, their voices dripping with familiarity. Aunt Margaret greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Look at you," she said. "You've turned into quite the professional. And that article, my goodness, front page." "Just local news," I replied. "Still," she continued, adjusting her pearls, "I suppose hard work does pay off sometimes." I could feel the sting behind her words, the kind of envy that hides behind polite admiration. Throughout the night, people asked about the resort project I was developing, an early concept I'd shared quietly with Jacob and a few potential investors. Somehow, everyone here seemed to know details I hadn't made public. Emily leaned in, feigning curiosity. "So, this resort you're designing, You think people will actually come all the way out to that coast? I don't think, I said evenly. I know. She laughed softly, brushing my arm. Well, I hope it works out. You've always had big dreams. The way she said it, the pause before big, made it sound like a flaw. By the end of the evening, I had spoken more to their disguised insecurities than their congratulations. I left early, driving back to Riverstone under a low, silver moon. The laughter from the hall echoed faintly in my ears, familiar yet distant, like a song from another life. When I reached home, I found an envelope on my doorstep. It was from the Marshes. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check, my first significant commission payment. They thanked me for turning decay into grace. I stared at the numbers until my eyes blurred. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked to the balcony, the city lights flickering below, and thought of my parents, of my father's tired hands, and my mother's quiet pride. I sent them a portion of the payment the next morning, a simple note attached. For everything you sacrificed. A week later, Jacob brought news an investor group from the city wanted to meet. They had seen the Clearwater article, and were interested in funding a small eco-resort prototype. It felt unreal. My dream, once dismissed over dinner tables, was slowly taking shape in boardrooms. The first investor meeting took place in a glass tower overlooking the harbor. I presented the concept for Solara Haven, describing how each villa would align with the sun's arc, how guests could walk from forest to sea without leaving the feeling of home. The investors nodded, some skeptical, some intrigued, but when I finished, one of them smiled. "You've got something rare, Miss Lorne," he said, vision rooted in sincerity. We shook hands. The deal was modest, but it was a beginning. That evening, as I walked home through the quiet streets, the sky rippling in dusky shades of gold and blue, I thought of the girl who once stared at the ceiling fan in her grandmother's house. She had been small, invisible, and voiceless, but she had never stopped dreaming. Still, somewhere in the corner of that victory, something dark was stirring. A few weeks later, I noticed discrepancies in my project budget. Minor amounts missing, insignificant at first glance, but enough to feel wrong. Jacob assured me it was probably an accounting oversight. I wanted to believe him, but that unease clung to me. At the next family dinner I attended, this time a smaller gathering for my father's birthday, Aunt Margaret pulled me aside as the others sang by the cake. "You're doing well," she said softly, eyes gleaming. "You must be careful, though. Success changes people, even those close to you." I smiled politely, but something in her tone chilled me. Later, as I left, I caught her whispering to my cousin Claire. "She thinks she's untouchable now. Pride comes before the fall." Their words echoed long after I drove away. I didn't know it then, but they were right about one thing. Something was coming, a fall I couldn't yet see, a betrayal already in motion. The betrayal didn't arrive with thunder. It came like a soft tide, creeping through cracks I didn't know existed. One moment, I was signing contracts for the resort's first construction phase. The next, I was standing in the ruins of everything I'd built, watching my name dissolve in silence. It began with the numbers. The first time I noticed, I was sitting in my office, a modest space overlooking the river, in Riverstone papers, spread across my desk, sunlight glinting off the glass window. The invoices didn't match. Payments had been processed to accounts I didn't recognize, small transfers that accumulated into thousands. At first, I blamed the accountant, a young man named Elliot who had joined through Jacob's recommendation. When I confronted him, he stammered, sweating through his collar. "It's just a clerical error, Miss Lorne," he said. "I'll sort it out." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe Jacob too, when he told me to stay calm, that these things happened in business. But there was a flicker in his eyes I hadn't seen before, something evasive, something that made my chest tighten. Weeks passed. The construction site at Clearwater Bay fell behind schedule. The investors grew restless, calling for progress reports I couldn't provide. My phone became a weapon of anxiety. Every ring felt like a verdict. Then came the letter. It arrived in a cream envelope stamped with the logo of Marin Designs. Inside was a single-page notice terminating my partnership effective immediately, citing ethical discrepancies and unapproved budget alterations. My hands trembled as I read the lines again and again, unable to breathe. Attached was a statement showing large withdrawals from the resort's project account, transactions I had never made, but all authorized under my digital signature. Jacob had framed me. The betrayal landed like a blade, slow and deep. I drove to his office that night, rain slanting against the windshield, streetlights stretching into golden smears through my tears. His secretary tried to stop me, but I pushed through the glass door, heart pounding. Jacob stood by the window, city lights burning behind him. "You used me," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands shook. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. "Ava," he sighed, as if I were a child who had misunderstood something simple. "You're talented, but you were naive. Investors lose patience, and someone had to take responsibility for the losses." "Losses?" I stepped forward. "You took the money." He turned then, face calm, almost sympathetic. "It's business. You'll recover from this if you're smart, but this partnership is over." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who had believed in my dream with the one standing before me now. "You said Solara Haven had soul," I whispered. He smiled faintly. "And now it has a cost." When I left his office, the rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened. I walked until my heels broke, until the city blurred into a smear of headlights and reflections. That night, I didn't go home. I sat on a bench near the river, watching the current drag bits of debris downstream. Everything I had worked for, every sleepless night, every design, every fragile step toward independence, had been stolen in silence. The news spread fast. Young designer accused of fraud in failed resort project. My inbox flooded with messages from clients withdrawing contracts, from reporters seeking comment. Even my landlord left a notice on my door, reminding me rent was due. Within a week, I was unemployed, disgraced, and drowning in debt that wasn't mine. My parents called every day, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't bear to hear the worry in my mother's voice or the disappointment in my father's silence. Cedar Ridge wasn't home anymore. It was a mirror I couldn't face. Then came the final blow. I returned to my office one morning to find the locks changed. Through the glass door, I could see movers packing up boxes, my sketches stacked like forgotten memories. Jacob's new assistant looked at me with practiced pity. "Mr. Marin asked me to give you this," she said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a check for $2,000 and a typed note, "For your contributions, best wishes." I tore it in half right there. That afternoon, as I stood outside the building, I saw Aunt Margaret's car pull up. She stepped out gracefully, pearls gleaming against her black coat. The sight of her in that moment, in front of the place where my dreams had died, was surreal. "Ava," she said, feigning concern. "I heard what happened. It's terrible, really, but these things happen when you climb too fast." I stared at her, too tired for anger. "You came here to gloat." "Not at all." She smiled thinly. "Family checks in on family. Besides, there's a lesson in humility here. Perhaps this will remind you where you came from." Her words hit harder than she knew. I watched her get back into her car, the tires hissing against wet asphalt, leaving me standing in the cold with nothing but the sound of the city swallowing my name. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled. I sold my furniture, gave up my apartment, and moved into a rented attic on the outskirts of town. The walls were thin, the roof leaked, and at night, the wind howled through the cracks. I lived off canned soup and regret. Every time I tried to sleep, I saw Jacob's calm eyes, Aunt Margaret's smile, the empty glass doors of my former office. One evening, I opened my old notebook, the one from my teenage years. Inside, between faded sketches, was a promise written in my younger handwriting. "I will build something no one can take from me." I closed the book, tears tracing salt lines down my face. I had believed success would silence them, that love or recognition could heal the wounds of childhood humiliation. But now, stripped of everything, I understood the truth. Silence was not peace, it was survival. The betrayal had hollowed me out. One night, I received a call from my mother. Her voice trembled. "Your father's been sick, Ava. You should come home." I wanted to say yes, but I couldn't face them not like this. "Tell him I'm okay," I whispered. "You're not," she said gently, "but you will be." After she hung up, I sat in the dark, listening to the rain tap against the window. Outside, the streetlight flickered like a heartbeat. I thought of my father sitting on the porch years ago, cigarette ember glowing in the night, telling me that sometimes your own blood makes you feel like a stranger. Now I understood what he meant. That night ended quietly. No music, no screams, just the slow, suffocating silence of a life dismantled piece by piece. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my own breath. The betrayal wasn't loud, but it was absolute, a quiet implosion that left nothing standing. In the morning, when the first light seeped through the cracked window, I whispered to myself, "This isn't the end." The winter that followed was the longest of my life. The sky seemed to have forgotten color, hanging low and gray over Riverstone like a lid on a dying flame. I lived in that attic for 6 months, in a space no larger than a storage room, with one crooked window that overlooked the alley below. The walls sweated in the rain and froze in the wind. I kept my coats on indoors, eating crackers and instant noodles, sketching on the floor when my hands weren't too cold to move a pencil. Every morning I walked to the public library to use their Wi-Fi, searching for work that didn't exist for someone whose reputation had been buried under scandal. My name had become synonymous with failure. Employers Googled me, saw headlines about fraud, and suddenly their polite smiles stiffened. I stopped trying after the 10th rejection. I stopped talking to anyone but the librarian, Mrs. Talbot, who sometimes slipped me tea in a paper cup and pretended not to notice the dark circles under my eyes. The hardest part wasn't hunger or loneliness. It was invisibility. I had gone from headlines to a ghost in the same city that once praised me. Even Jacob's betrayal became a rumor worn thin by repetition, until it no longer sounded like my story but a cautionary tale for others. That young designer who flew too close to the Sunday? At night, when the wind howled through the roof beams, I thought of my father. He had been ill for months now. My mother's letters hinted at hospital visits, bills they could barely pay. I wanted to go home, but shame was heavier than distance. I couldn't bear the thought of stepping into that old house with nothing but defeat in my hands. One evening, I found myself walking by the river again. The water was dark and sluggish, reflecting the fractured glow of the city lights. I leaned over the railing, the cold biting through my sleeves, and whispered to the wind, "I'm still here." It wasn't defiance, it was survival. The next morning, I received a letter from Mrs. Talbot. She was moving to live with her daughter in another state, and offered me her old house for a month, free of rent, if I promised to take care of her garden. I accepted without thinking. When I arrived, the key turned stiffly in the lock, and the air inside smelled of old books and lavender. There was a small study by the window, a wooden desk, and sunlight that cut through the dust like mercy. That house became my cocoon. I spent my days pruning the overgrown yard, mending leaks, and in the evenings, sketching again. But this time, I didn't design resorts or villas. I drew small shelters, cabins, cottages, spaces where people could rest, heal, and feel human again. I filled page after page, the lines rough but alive. Somewhere in that process, the despair began to loosen its grip. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the attic, I found one of Mrs. Talbot's old journals. Between recipes and pressed flowers, she had written a quote in faded ink. "You can't rebuild what you refuse to touch." I sat with those words for hours. They struck something deep, a realization that I had been running from my own ruins. I'd built walls around the pain, pretending to be waiting for justice, when what I needed was to face the ashes and start over with my own hands. That night, I wrote 3 words in my sketchbook: start from silence. The next morning, I began planning something new. Not a resort, not yet, but a place small, real, tangible. I looked up cheap plots of land outside the city, places nobody wanted because they were too far from convenience or too close to wilderness. And then I found it, an abandoned campsite near Lake Halden, 2 hours north of Riverstone. It had been shut down for years, overgrown with weeds, but the photos showed a breathtaking view of the lake and the forest beyond. The asking price was laughably low. The owner wanted it gone, fast. I used the last of my savings money meant for survival, not investment, and bought it. When I told my mother, her voice cracked through the phone. "You're starting over?" "I have to," I said. "I can't let them write my ending." The first time I saw Lake Halden, the sky was a pale wash of blue, and the air smelled of pine and thawing earth. The cabins were half collapsed, the dock splintered, the main lodge filled with dust and silence. But when I stood there, the wind brushing against my face, I felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt since Clearwater. Hope. I spent the next year rebuilding, plank by plank. I took odd jobs to fund repairs, waitressing, painting fences, even cleaning other people's houses. Every paycheck went into nails, wood, paint, and survival. The work was brutal, but it healed me in ways comfort never could. Each swing of the hammer felt like reclaiming a heartbeat. During those months, I wrote letters to my father, even though I wasn't sure if he'd ever read them. I told him about the lake, about how the mornings smelled like dew and pine sap, how the water turned silver at sunset. I told him I was building again, not for glory, but for peace. He passed away before I could send the last letter. My mother called one night, her voice hollow and quiet. I sat by the lake until dawn, watching the fog lift from the surface. Grief didn't hit me all at once. It seeped in, slow and relentless. But even in that sorrow, there was a strange calm. My father had always believed in hard, honest work, and in a way, he was still here in the wood beneath my hands, in the steady rhythm of rebuilding. By the end of that year, the first cabin was ready. It wasn't much: one room, a stove, and a wide window facing the lake, but it stood straight, sturdy, alive. I slept on the floor that night, the wind whispering through the trees, and for the first time in years I felt safe. Word began to spread. A local hiker passed through, took photos, and posted them online with the caption, "A forgotten lake comes back to life." Soon others reached out: writers, travelers, small families looking for somewhere quiet. I didn't plan for it, but the cabins filled one by one. I named the place Havenwood, not a resort yet, but a refuge. When I looked at what I'd built with my own hands, the tears came easily. They weren't of sorrow anymore, but release. I realized then that revenge wasn't born in anger. It was born in persistence, in the refusal to stay buried. The fire inside me no longer burned wild, it burned steady, controlled, purposeful. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I was building freedom. And when the time came, that same fire would light the path back to those who once laughed. Only this time, they'd stand behind the counter, serving drinks to guests who spoke my name with respect. But for now, I kept the silence. The foundation was being laid, not just for a place, but for a reckoning that would come dressed as success. And somewhere deep within the pine shadows of Havenwood, my revenge began to take form, not out of rage, but rebirth. The second spring at Lake Halden came with the scent of pine and wet soil, the kind that clings to your hands and stays in your hair. Havenwood was no longer a lonely idea, it had become a living thing. 5 cabins stood proudly by the water now, their windows glowing amber at dusk, their porches wrapped in laughter from guests who came seeking something they couldn't name. Writers, couples, quiet souls from the city, they all left changed, lighter. I moved into the old lodge that I'd turned into a home and reception area. The floorboards still creaked, the wood stove still smoked when it rained, but it was mine. Every nail, every beam, every scar on the wood carried my story. It was around that time that a travel journalist, Maya Corbin, visited by chance. She'd been driving through the countryside, got lost, and stopped for a night. She stayed a week instead. When she left, she promised to write about Havenwood. I didn't think much of it until, a month later, the feature appeared online, "The Woman Who Turned Her Ruins into Paradise." The article went viral. Bookings doubled in 2 weeks, then tripled. People came from as far as Boston and Chicago. I hired local workers, including a few single mothers from nearby towns. The resort, because by then it had become one, grew into a sanctuary for those running from the noise of the world. Every dawn I stood by the lake, barefoot in the grass, watching the fog roll away. The reflection staring back at me no longer carried the weight of humiliation. I had rebuilt from the ashes, and each sunrise felt like a quiet promise. I was ready to be seen again, but this time on my own terms. The turning point came when the Regional Business Guild announced an upcoming hospitality convention in Riverstone, my hometown. The same city where I'd been laughed at, stripped of dignity, and left to vanish. The same city where Jacob still managed Clearwater, the project that was once mine. I registered Havenwood as an exhibitor. I didn't tell anyone. The day of the event, I arrived early, setting up my booth with soft lighting, pine-scented candles, and a looping slideshow of the lake. People stopped, drawn in by the warmth. I saw their expressions soften as they watched guests kayaking in the mist, families roasting marshmallows by firelight, writers scribbling by the window. My resort wasn't just a destination, it was a story. Halfway through the day, I saw him. Jacob. He looked almost the same: sharp suit, perfect posture, but there was something hollow in his eyes now. Clearwater had grown, yes, but the glow was gone, its reputation had dimmed. Too many cost-cutting rumors, too many unsatisfied clients. I stood still, letting him wander closer until he stopped right in front of my booth. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly. "Ava?" I smiled, calm, deliberate. "Welcome to Havenwood." Recognition flickered, followed by something colder: disbelief, maybe even fear. Before he could speak again, one of the guild's organizers approached, asking if I'd be available for a panel discussion that afternoon on sustainable independent resorts. Jacob's jaw tightened as he listened. "She's the guest speaker?" he asked, incredulous. The organizer nodded. "Her work's been featured in Travel Now, Harbor Life, and the New England Review. You've heard of her, haven't you?" Jacob didn't answer. He just stepped back, eyes darting between the slideshow and my name printed across the banner, Havenwood Resort, founded by Ava Hart. When I took the stage later that day, the lights were soft, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper brochures. I spoke about rebuilding with integrity, about creating places that restore not only land but spirit. I never mentioned names, never pointed fingers, but I saw Jacob in the audience, sitting stiffly in the third row. Every word I spoke pressed against the silence between us like a blade wrapped in velvet. Afterward, people surrounded me, journalists, investors, small resort owners asking for mentorship. For the first time, I felt something shift. Not triumph, not pride, but reclamation. My story was no longer one of loss. It was legacy. But that was only the beginning. Months later, expansion offers flooded in. One came from a chain that owned several luxury venues, including Clearwater. They wanted to collaborate on a joint nature retreat concept. When I read the proposal, the irony nearly made me laugh. The project manager listed under Clearwater's name was Jacob. I signed the preliminary meeting request. The boardroom where we met was high above the city, glass walls overlooking the skyline I once walked beneath in shame. Jacob entered last, unaware I would be there. The moment he saw me seated at the head of the table, his steps faltered. I gestured politely to the empty chair opposite mine. "Let's discuss business," I said. He swallowed hard, his composure slipping for a heartbeat. The others in the room greeted me with respect, addressing me as Miss Hart. I spoke with precision, no bitterness, no gloating. I laid out my conditions: full creative control, equal profit share, and that Clearwater's staff undergo a leadership overhaul, focusing on ethics and community rebuilding. It was poetic justice disguised as professionalism. The executives nodded in approval. Jacob sat there, cornered by the very structure he had built on my downfall. He tried to interject once, but I cut him off gently. "You've done enough leading for a lifetime, Jacob. It's time to serve something larger than yourself." The room fell quiet. That day, Havenwood entered a new chapter, one rooted not in revenge, but in precision. I didn't need to destroy him. I only needed to stand where he could see that the person he broke had become untouchable. Months later, Clearwater's parent company collapsed under internal audits and mismanagement. The fallout was swift. Jacob lost his position, his credibility, and eventually, his ownership stake. I didn't gloat. Instead, I made a quiet call to the property manager of Clearwater and offered to purchase the resort's assets at auction. When the paperwork cleared, the deed bore my name. It took me 3 years to transform that place. The cold glass walls gave way to warm timber. The marble floors were replaced with reclaimed oak. Guests no longer came for prestige, they came for peace. And when I reopened the resort under the name Havenwood by the Sea, I invited local workers to staff it. Among the applicants were 2 of my distant relatives, the same cousins who once mocked me at that wedding years ago, when I was nothing but a girl with foolish dreams and an empty purse. They didn't recognize me at first. But when I stepped into the room to conduct interviews, the silence was heavy and slow. "Ava?" one of them whispered, color draining from her face. I smiled faintly. "Welcome to Havenwood. I hope you're ready to serve our guests well." They both nodded, trembling, their eyes avoiding mine. I didn't humiliate them. I didn't mention the laughter, the mockery, the cruelty that had once burned through me. I simply hired them under fair pay, fair conditions, because real power wasn't in payback, it was in composure. The grand reopening was breathtaking. Lanterns floated over the sea, violins played beneath the stars, and I stood on the terrace watching the same people who once doubted me now offering drinks and carrying trays through a resort that bore my vision, my name, my rebirth. Every brick, every flame, every shadow in that place was a part of my story, the one they tried to erase. And in that moment, I realized my revenge had already landed, not with a shout, but with silence so profound it echoed through the ocean breeze. Morning comes softly at Havenwood by the sea. The light spills through the glass like a benediction, warm and golden, stretching across the polished oak floors of the terrace. From where I stand, the horizon feels endless silver water breathing against the sand, the air carrying the scent of salt and pine. Guests wander barefoot along the shoreline, laughter drifting like music. Somewhere behind me, a bell rings from the dining hall, signaling breakfast. The sound blends into the rhythm of waves, steady and timeless. I built this place with silence, patience, and an ache that became art. Every corner of Havenwood tells a story of loss turned into design, of despair reborn as peace. The cabins, the gardens, the cliffside spa, all of them grew from sketches once drawn in a freezing attic when I had nothing left but hope and hunger. The staff moves gracefully through the morning rush, setting tables and pouring coffee. Among them, the faces I once knew, the ones that once turned away, the ones that laughed. My relatives move quietly now, in uniforms pressed and clean, tending to guests who speak my name with reverence. There is no cruelty in how I watch them, only distance. They nod when they see me, voices small but respectful. Good morning, Miss Hart. I return the greeting with calm grace. They serve here not out of punishment, but because life, in its patient wisdom, placed them exactly where lessons unfold. I no longer carry the weight of vengeance. What they feel when they see me the unease, the guilt that is their story to live, not mine to fuel. When guests ask about the history of Havenwood, I tell them fragments. I speak of resilience, of a woman who rebuilt, after ruin. I never mention names, never point toward shadows. The past doesn't deserve the spotlight it's already written in the foundations beneath our feet. At night, when the resort quiets, I walk the gardens alone. Lanterns flicker under the cypress trees, the ocean hums softly in the dark, and the air feels full of memory. I often pause by the reflecting pool near the cliff. It mirrors the sky so perfectly that sometimes I lose sense of where earth ends and heaven begins. In that stillness, I remember everything: the laughter at the wedding, the cruel whispers at Clearwater, the hunger that drove me, the attic's bitter cold. But now, they arrive not as wounds, but as pages from an old book whose story has already been told. They can't touch me anymore. Success came, yes, but not as I imagined. It wasn't glitter or applause or magazine covers, though those came too. True triumph was quieter. It was the morning I paid off my mother's debts without fanfare, the day I opened scholarships for local youth who wanted to study design, the moment a guest wrote in the visitor's journal. I found myself again here. There are photographs on the lodge wall now, one of my father, holding a hammer, smiling faintly at the camera. He never saw Havenwood, but his hands are everywhere in it. Every beam, every nail, feels like a conversation with him, a continuation of what he taught me, to build with honesty, even when the world looks away. Sometimes, I see Jacob's name in business journals, usually buried beneath reports of failed ventures. He's still chasing something, perhaps redemption, perhaps relevance. I bear him no hatred. If not for his betrayal, I might never have found the stillness of this place, never learned what it meant to rebuild from nothing. His downfall was simply the echo of his own choices. A few months ago, he came to Havenwood. I was sitting by the lake garden when the front desk called to tell me a man was waiting. When I walked into the lobby and saw him standing there, older, thinner, carrying the weight of years, I didn't feel anger, only completion. He tried to speak, to explain, but I stopped him gently. "There's no need," I said. "You helped me more than you'll ever know." His eyes welled, though he tried to hide it. He asked to see the resort, to walk through the spaces he once tried to erase me from. I let him. We walked in silence, past the terrace where guests sipped wine, past the cliff path glowing gold in the evening Sunday. When we reached the edge overlooking the sea, he whispered, "You did it." "I did," I said simply. And that was enough. He left soon after, his car fading into the road that curved through the pines. I stood there long after, the wind lifting my hair, the waves below catching the sunset in shards of light. I didn't feel victory. I felt peace. In the month since, Havenwood has grown beyond me. It has become a living promise, a retreat where people arrive broken and leave lighter. The staff joke that the land itself heals those who come here. Maybe it does. Maybe pain, when transformed, becomes its own kind of grace. Every evening, I light a lantern and set it afloat on the sea. One for each year since the beginning. They drift out like soft stars, carrying pieces of the past into the horizon. Watching them, I understand what my father once meant when he said, "The hardest part of building is learning when to stop holding the hammer." Now I build with silence, with light. Sometimes, new guests recognize me from that old article, "The Woman Who Turned Her Ruins into Paradise." They ask how it feels to have triumphed over everyone who once doubted me. I smile and tell them the truth. The sweetest revenge was not in their ruin, I say, but in the life I built without them. The wind carries those words toward the open water, scattering them across the surface like petals. The horizon fades to indigo, and the lights of Havenwood glow behind me, steady and golden. I turn toward the sound of laughter from the terrace, toward the warmth of everything I've made, and in that moment, I know the story is no longer about pain or payback. It's about becoming whole in the quiet after the storm. The past can watch from a distance. The future can wait its turn. For now, the sea breathes against the shore, the stars rise above the pines, and I walk through the soft light of my own creation, free, unshaken, and finally home. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and follow for more stories like this. Your support keeps these memories alive.